this morning, starting with Hosea. So we thank you for how you used this man, the example of his life, and the tough times that he had to go through to be this example for Israel and you, Lord. So we thank you for this book, and we pray that it opens our eyes to just see how great your gospel is. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so we are in the book of Hosea this morning. Finished up Amos the last couple months, and now we're into pretty much the longest minor prophet. Zechariah is the other one with 14 chapters. I don't know actually word for word which one's longer, but this is one of the longest books in the minor prophets of the 12. We've been going in chronological order. I don't know if you have your sheet or whatever. We're on the fifth minor prophet. We went through Obadiah, Joel, Jonah, Amos, and Hosea now. So in chronological order, obviously the first two, if you remember, those two were pretty well debated on the time frame of those prophets. Some could have said Obadiah was down in the 500s BC. So big range of when that could have happened, but we've been using MacArthur's timeline here. So Obadiah, Joel, Jonah, Amos, and now Hosea. So when we think about the minor prophets, as we said before, they're not minor because there's less in what they say or less value in what they say. It's just because of the length or the size of the prophet, or of the words that were written. Like I said, this one is one of the largest, this or Zechariah. But just to give an overview again, like we've kind of done at the beginning of each of the books, just thinking in terms of Kings, the Old Testament, the dates that these prophets are talking about. We go all the way back to Saul. So we have the judges, then we go back to the kings, then we go to the kings, which Saul was the first king. Then we had David, and then we had Solomon. And that was with the United Kingdom. And that started in about 1000 BC with Saul. Then in 930 BC was the divided kingdom. That's when it broke out after Solomon. So we had Solomon's servant, who was who? Jeroboam. And then we had Solomon's son, Rehoboam. And so we had the divided kingdom. Jeroboam was over who? Israel, the northern 10 tribes. And then we had Rehoboam was southern. And how many tribes was that? Two. Judah and Benjamin. Okay, so it was broke out. So Solomon's servant, and then we had Solomon's son. And so we've been, if you remember, we first looked at Obadiah, and that was a prophecy to Edom. But then we looked at Joel, it was a prophecy to Judah. Then we had Jonah, it was a prophecy to Nineveh. Then we had Amos, which spent most of our time talking about the northern 10 tribes, Israel. And now Hosea is prophesying also mainly for the northern 10 tribes. But we see more throughout the book of Hosea than we did Amos dealing with Judah also. So there is times that we see it's talking about Israel and Judah. But the focus is still on the northern 10 tribes. And now Amos and Hosea probably overlapped in their time frame as they prophesied. They were contemporaries. They were prophesying probably at the same time, or towards the end of Amos's ministry and the beginning of Hosea's overlapped there. Okay. So now the two dates that are coming up, the one date for sure is the 722, when the Assyrians come in and send the 10 northern tribes into exile. Hosea is the last prophet before this happens. If you look on your timeline, you'll see Hosea was from 755, and there's debate on these dates, but overall, this is in the general time frame, 755 to 710. So he prophesies after the fall of the 10 northern tribes. Okay? So this is the two dates. We look at the 722, and we're looking at 586. 586 was the time the Babylonians came in and sent the southern two tribes into exile. Okay? So 7:22. That's what we're dealing with right here. That is what he's talking about, just like Amos was, focusing on the 10 northern tribes. He was telling them, this day of the Lord is coming, this judgment is coming, and it's going to be with the Assyrians. God is sending in the Assyrians, and he's going to take you into exile. And if you remember, we've talked about before, but the Assyrians were very good at how they did this. They would leave some. So they would export some of them out. They would send them out. They would send them into exile. They would send them away from the land. They would leave some, and then they would import, like POWs, prisoners of wars that they captured from other areas, and send into the land. So now you had what that people group was called after this time, thinking in the New Testament, Samaritans, right? Because you had this, they would basically breed out their nationalism. They would just get rid of that through bringing other people in, and they did a great job of it by doing that, because then there wasn't rebellion. If you left all the same people together, what do? They're going to, at some point, conspire against and rebel against the ones that took them over. Well, now they interbreed, they do this, and there's really the lost 10 tribes. I mean, they're gone. They aren't around. So this is the time of Hosea. The same as Amos. He's prophesying to Israel, telling them this day is coming. And if you remember from the book of Amos, what was happening? They weren't listening. They were thinking they were just fine. There's no problems with what's going on here. No issues at all. We are good. We have our religion. Everything is perfect. If the day of the Lord comes, it's going to be like us being redeemed out of Egypt. Everything is great. And that's how they're thinking. Okay? So let's flip to Hosea. So Hosea is the first book after the four major prophets. Four major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. And so you got the four major prophets with Lamentations splitting in between them. And then you have the first minor prophet starts as Hosea. Okay, so first verse. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea the son of Beeri in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. Okay, so we don't learn a lot of Hosea besides the time frame and basically who his father is. But this is pretty common for prophets. This is what they do. They're going to tell you basically when they prophesied by talking about the kings. And the majority of the time they'll say who their father is. Sometimes they'll say something else, like Amos said he was from Tekoa. So it gave us a little more information. There was a few more, and I think it said he was a shepherd too. He was a shepherd? Yeah. So he's among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Judah. So we saw a little bit more information about him. So the only thing we know about Hosea is from actually Hosea, that his father is Beeri. But what's interesting is you look at the book, you start to learn a lot about Hosea because God uses him as an example. Where most books, God gives him a word and he prophesies and he speaks it, or he gives him a vision and he speaks it and he tells them what God was saying. Now, in Hosea, it's a little different because the Lord speaks to Hosea and he says, go take yourself a wife of whoredom. So now he's supposed to go do this. He's going to be an example for Hosea, and his wife is going to be an example and their children for God and his people, Israel. So in this first verse, though, it's interesting because he uses four kings from the southern tribe, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, and he only mentions one king from Israel, which is actually mainly prophesying to Israel, which is kind of interesting why he does that. And he doesn't even say the whole time, because if Jeroboam actually died, it was 41 years, so he died before the exile, because there was more kings that come about. But these kings actually range in 100-year span. So for the time of Uzziah, and actually through the end of Hezekiah, because Jeroboam's kind of in the middle there, that king of Israel. So it's a 100-year span, so nobody's really fully sure on how long he prophesied, but most would argue with the overlapping of Jeroboam that it's probably around 45 years, somewhere in that range. So he could have been one of the longest prophesying prophets that was out there, especially in the minor prophets. Probably not compared to Isaiah or Jeremiah. But for a long period of time. And we see that because God uses them as an example. He's talking about go marry a wife of whoredom, go have children of whoredom. So now this takes time. It's not like God's just telling him, this is what I see, go prophesy. He's actually going to use them as an example. Okay, so if you remember Jeroboam, does anybody remember anything about Jeroboam? Now remember, this is Jeroboam the second. This is the same king that Amos was talking about in the book of Amos. Does anybody remember anything about Jeroboam? Probably the biggest thing is he restored the land. You remember that? When there was prosperity in the land. They lost some of the land to Syria before Jeroboam took over as king. And then when Jeroboam came in, we learn in 2 Kings 14 that he restored this land, all the land of Israel and the northern tribes, all that land back to the Israelites. So it was prosperous. They were doing well, but there was a lot of moral decay, if you remember what was happening to the land. Prosperity, but moral decay. They oppressed the poor. They stole from the poor. They had their religious system that was idolatry. They just trusted in their system instead of Yahweh. We saw that all through the book of Amos. And so you had Jeroboam the second. He reigned for 41 years. And then after that, it went downhill really quick. Because you had this moral decay because of their prosperity. And then it went down really quick. Then there's like 6 kings before the fall in 722. So we had Zechariah. That was the son of Jeroboam. He's the next king. He was murdered within 6 months by Shallum. Shallum, 1 month later, was killed and replaced by Menahem. Menahem died, and his son Pekahiah reigned in his place. Then Pekahiah was assassinated by Pekah 2 years later, and then Pekah was assassinated by Hosea. So everybody killed each other to get to the throne. They got there, and it was just the succession happened pretty quick. 6 within this short period of time, and then Hosea leads them in to exile on a quick slope. And Hosea, it's interesting. It's Hosea.
No
O'Shea. Yeah, no relation. But it's O'Shea. It's spelled the same way, Hosea. But it's, why does it say Hosea? O'Shea.
Maybe we should be
Hosea. Maybe you should be
But
O'Shea.
people have said
We should be
O'Shea.
O'Shea.
Yeah.
You should be I'm going to start calling you O'Shea. So I'm like,
You're going to cut this out in the recording.
okay. So quickly, these kings, the succession goes down quickly, like 6 kings, they go into exile in 722, okay? And during this whole time, Hosea is prophesying, and the nation of Israel is seeing this example that God uses through Hosea and Gomer. Okay, so this book breaks down into basically 2 big sections. Chapters 1 through 3, and chapters 4 through 14. If most of you have read the book of Hosea, and most of you will probably remember the first 3 chapters. And then the 4 through 14, you probably don't remember a whole lot, because the story is in 1 through 3. And after that, he prophesies to the nation of Israel and to Judah about verses 4, 1 through 2, 1 and 2. He says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land." So a charge or a case against the inhabitants of the land. "There is no faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and committing adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed." And this is because of their idolatry. This is what's going to happen to them because of their idolatry. He's prophesying, saying, you have no faithfulness or steadfast love and no knowledge of God in the land. This is the charge against you. In chapter 4, verse 12, we see, "My people inquire of a piece of wood, and their walking staff gives them oracles. For a spirit of whoredom has led them astray, and they have left their God to play the whore." Idolatry. Chapter 8, verse 14. "For Israel has forsaken or forgotten his maker, and builds palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. So I will send a fire upon his cities, and it shall devour his stronghold. For Israel has forgotten his maker." So it's not that Israel doesn't believe God exists. It's that they put him outside of their daily life. They have some knowledge of God. He's out on the circumference of their life. This guy used this great example. And it's perfect for America because we do the exact same thing. He was talking about God being on the circumference of someone's life. He said, I'll just quote this so I don't get it wrong. He says, "Not that they, no, over here." He says, it does no good to have "in God we trust" around the circumference of our coins if we don't have trust in God at the center of our commerce. Let me read that again. "It does no good to have "in God we trust" around the circumference of our coins if we don't have trust in God at the center of our commerce." So at the center of our buying and our selling. And if you remember in Amos, what did they do? They oppressed the poor. They did everything against the poor, even though they knew God's law. They knew how God said you should treat, how you should be fair in your commerce, how you shouldn't have two weights, how you shouldn't cheat the people. They knew that. But their hearts were wrong. So it's like in America, we will do a lot to make sure we still have "in God we trust" on our coin. People will fight for that, to make sure that that doesn't ever get removed. They'll spend a lot of time doing that. But it's like all we care about is that symbol that it says on there, but our hearts aren't right. Especially in this culture, because we're in the exact same culture. In a culture of prosperity, but there's moral decay. Prosperity and moral decay, they lead together. When you have prosperity, it leads to moral decay. That's why I heard somebody a while back ago said the prosperity gospel is an oxymoron. Because here we're telling people about the prosperity. It's like you want this, you need this, you have this, and you want to tell people to get this. But what does it really do? It leads to moral decay because you trust in your prosperity. And that's what you do. And you trust in that. And that's exactly, in our culture, that's what we do. We trust in our prosperity. And we want to put this label over it, "in God we trust," or we want to make sure the 10 Commandments are on the wall at the Washington, D.C., or wherever we're at. But our hearts aren't right. This country's hearts aren't for God. But we want to try to defend that. And that's what they were doing. They were doing the same thing. They were going into Bethel. They were going into Gilgal. They're going to worship. They're taking their pilgrimages down to Beersheba. They're doing these things, but their heart is not right. It's idolatry. And they're mixing in Baal worship and all these other things. And that's exactly what we do in this country. It's the exact same thing. This is one of my, Deuteronomy 6. You probably know this verse. But when I think about our country, this verse is just another reminder. And it's a reminder exactly what was happening at the time of Hosea. In chapter 6, verse 10, the verses familiar, or before that, are probably very familiar to you. But he says, "Then, and when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." And it goes on. But what does he say? He's saying, when you get to the land, when you're there, and you have all these things in a sense that you did not do, but it's prosperity, you have all these things, then take care lest you forget the Lord. And that is exactly what has happened in the time of Hosea. And honestly, I think that's exactly what's happened in this country with our prosperity and the things we have. And we forget the Lord. Because there's a lot of times there isn't a reason to trust in God when you have everything. We never worry about food on our table. We never worry about, probably really in a sense, a whole lot of money in our pocket. We may struggle, we may have debt, we may have some different things in our life, but we don't have to trust in the same way as people did at this time when the locust plague comes in and wipes out all their land. It's different, and they were in a time of prosperity. And these people were even so hard-hearted that we saw in the book of Amos that God kept sending these things, and they still weren't returning to the Lord. They still weren't repenting. So this prosperity that they have leads to chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. Because of their prosperity, for the Lord has a charge with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love or no knowledge of God in the land. And there is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, commit adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of their prosperity, this is exactly where they are. These three things that we see. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. So we have these first three chapters that is, we can look at this in two ways. Like, this is his personal tragedy, these things that are going to happen to Hosea that he has to go through in chapters 1 through 3. And then we see in chapters 4 through 14 this national tragedy that is going to happen, talking about God and the nation of Israel. So Hosea's life is like a big sermon to the nation. He's saying, this is application right here. This is it. This is what's there's no better way to show you than taking a wife of whoredom. There is no better way. And to the men at this time, to take a wife of whoredom would have been outlandish. Which you have some that say this is just an allegory. That this is just a symbolic. Because they have such a problem with God saying, go take a wife of whoredom. They have such a problem with that they say this has to be an allegory. This has to be just a symbolic of what the nation is. And John Calvin actually goes down this road. And he says that's the way it has to be. I think he's wrong. And I think most commentators now will take one or two other views. There's multiple ones, and we'll get into this more when we dig in a little bit. But some will say that he didn't actually take a current prostitute. She wasn't actually a prostitute at the time Hosea took her as his wife. And when you read verse 1, you might have some challenges with that, or verse 2. We'll come to that in a second. Secondly, some say that, man, just take it Just read it plainly. This is what it says. This is what he did. He actually took a wife that was actually a prostitute at the time. She already was a prostitute. He took her as a wife, and then she was unfaithful in their marriage also. So that second view that I was talking about, that this is where most commentators go, the majority of them. They'll say that she became a prostitute after Hosea married her. So the only way you can understand verse 2 then, when he says, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. So how you would have to understand that is that he's describing an event taking place before it happened. So describing an event taking place before it happened. So he's treating of a future event as if it already happened. Because it's pretty clear what that verse says. He says, take yourself a wife of whoredom. So however you land on that, I think we have to at least land that it's not symbolic and it's not allegory. It's actually taken place. It actually has happened. Because most argue that, man, if you are going to say it's an allegory and God says this, he's actually saying it could happen, so that still would be a problem, if that makes sense. So I think, I'm not sure which way I'd land on the last two. Yeah, John.
So on that one view, I think it was the last one, you're saying he took a wife and later she went into prostitution?
The second one, yeah, later. So she wasn't a prostitute when he married her.
Because people say that because God just wouldn't command something.
Wouldn't command that, because we see things in like the New Testament, 1 Corinthians, it says, what does one have to do, unequally yoked, those kinds of things. You wouldn't marry someone that was a prostitute.
But he was a prophet. I mean, to me, he's in his own category.
And they're both Israelites.
I don't know what so much that he's in on this,
Yeah.
but it's way more consistent with God and his people, right? I mean, he didn't choose people who were good and then turn bad.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah, that's a good point.
He chose sinners.
So you would say, hey, he took on a prostitute.
Yeah.
Just read it as what it is.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
And that's where Borgman lands on this. I probably maybe heard him talk about Borgman, but he lands and he says, hey, this is what it says. Go with it. This is God. God can do what God wants to do. And I think that's a great point, Jordan, that exactly. Because there is nothing better than this is a picture of the gospel.
It's kind of like God commanding Isaiah to go naked for 3 years. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of contrary to
Not appropriate.
all normal morality, and yet
It seems to, yeah.
They arrest streakers.
Yeah. Even immoral people
Yeah,
arrest
right.
streakers. So yeah. So we can dig a little more into that later, but so here's the story. So he tells him, however we take that. So then he says, go take yourself a wife of whoredom in verse 2, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom for forsaking the Lord. So take your wife and have children. So what happens here? So vows were made. So Gomer, he takes his wife, vows were made, a covenant is made. And that's why this is such a great picture, because what did God do? He chose a people. He had a covenant with those people. Those people broke that covenant. And exactly what does Gomer do? She breaks that covenant by being unfaithful to Hosea. So then God says in verse 4, he says, and the Lord said to him, and have children, call his name Jezreel,
For in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So Jezreel means scattered. We'll dig into that later. But Jezreel means scattered. So the people are going to be scattered. And that's the name of the first child. Call his name Jezreel. Then we see in verse 6, she conceived again and bore a daughter. And the Lord said to him, call her name No Mercy. For I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow or by sword or by war or by horses or by horsemen. So he bore a daughter. Some commentators would argue that this daughter was not his daughter, because if you look up in the end of verse 3, it says, bore him a son. So that was Hosea's child, bore him a son. But then in this verse, in verse 6, it says bore a daughter. It doesn't say bore him a daughter. So most would argue that this actually isn't his child. This is her being unfaithful. And he says, call her name No Mercy. He will have no mercy on them. They have crossed the line. They've gone to a point. We saw that multiple times in the book of Amos, where God was done. Judgment was going to happen. He was going to remove his people. Assyria is coming. It's not going to happen. But he says, I will have mercy on the house of Judah. And this prophecy is actually fulfilled at the time in 722 when the Assyrians come in. Sennacherib is the king of Assyria. He comes in, and you probably remember this story because Hezekiah is the king of Judah, and Hezekiah gets with Isaiah and he prays. And he says, Sennacherib's coming in. He's gonna take us out just like he did the northern 10 tribes. And he prays, and God sends an angel. And what does he do? He doesn't do it by bow or by sword or by war or by horses or by horsemen. He sends in an angel and wipes out 185,000 of the Assyrian troops. And that's in Isaiah. You find that in Isaiah 37, verse 36, or 2 Chronicles 32, is that story. And he comes in and he wipes them out. So that prophecy's fulfilled. He has mercy on the southern 2 tribes and not on the northern 10. And then he has his third child. In verse 8, when she had weaned No Mercy, she conceived and bore a son. So most would argue again, this is a son. There she was unfaithful to Hosea. It's not his child. And the Lord said, call his name not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. So there's progression that we see. First he scatters, first he has no mercy. Now he's saying, you are not my people at all. And I am not your God. That's some pretty bold language that happens here. So this is the main story that we're going to see in chapters 1, 2, and 3 that Hosea is called to do. Hosea is called to take a wife of whoredom. Hosea is called to have children of whoredom. All these things. And this is the example. This is what they are to see. And then we see in those verses, in chapters 4 through 14, how he's helping them see who they are. And the reason this is happening, he says, because they're unfaithful, because they have no steadfast love, because they have no covenant love. God kept his covenant, but they didn't keep theirs. And that they have no knowledge of God. They have no intimate relationship with God. They have knowledge in their head. But they don't truly know God. They don't know God at all. And because we can have knowledge, right? People can have knowledge, but not have an intimate relationship with God. That saying I always say, theology without doxology is hypocrisy. This is exactly what they had. They had some theology. They understood things about God,
but they didn't have praise and worship for God. It didn't lead to the heart and then outflow in praise, and it became hypocrisy because all they did is in their religion, they worshipped Baal. There was syncretism. It all was mixed together in a big mess. So it was just pure hypocrisy. They were doing outward things because they weren't faithful. They didn't have steadfast love, and they had no knowledge, intimate knowledge of who God was. And then you see in chapters 4 through 14, if you want an outline for these, this is kind of simple. It goes in reverse order how he deals with these things. So he deals with the knowledge of God, then he deals with steadfast love, and then he deals with their no faithfulness. So in chapters 4, verse 2 through 6:3, he deals with their no knowledge. 4:2 through 6:3. Then he deals with that they don't have covenant love. They don't have steadfast love, hesed, through 6:4 through 10:15.
Say that one again,
No covenant love. And then we see no faithfulness in chapters 11 verse 12 through 14 verse 9. 11 verse 12.
Went from 10:15 to 11:12.
Yep. And 14, the end of the book. So Hosea shows us in these chapters images from the family, images from nature. He shows Israel as the unfaithful wife. He shows Israel as the ungrateful son. He shows Israel as the stubborn heifer. He shows Israel as the silly dove. All these different things, these pictures of Israel, is they're ungrateful, unfaithful, stubborn, but God's love is not exhausted in this. That's why this is such a great picture of the gospel. You have this amazing love that God has. There's no book probably better in the Bible that shows God's amazing love than the book of Hosea. To a stiff-necked people, a rebellious people, a people that have rejected God, they have idolatry, they whore after everything else, and God's love still stands. God's love still stands. And even when they come back, it's only because of the grace of God. That's the only reason, because God's love. What they truly deserve is to be divorced. God's people truly deserve to be divorced. Just like Gomer truly deserves just to be divorced. Set aside. But this is the greatest picture. This is one of the greatest pictures of the gospel in the Bible, what we have here. Just like what Jordan was saying. God goes after a people that don't deserve him. They don't deserve his love. They deserve nothing from God. In the book of Hosea, we see multiple times that this book is quoted in the New Testament. Peter quotes it, Paul quotes it, talking about the Gentiles that are brought into the church. They both quote that use that once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. And that's every single one of us. Once we weren't a people, but now we are God's people. If you look at the end of chapter 3, what does it say? In verse 23, I will sow her for myself in the land, and I will have mercy on no mercy. And I will say to not my people, you are my people. And he shall say, you are my God. What's that?
That was chapter 2.
Oh, thank you. What did I say?
Chapter 3.
Yeah, chapter 3. I'm sorry. Chapter 2, verse 23. He says, I will have mercy on no mercy, and I will say to not my people, you are my people, and he shall say, you are my God. God is gracious. God is love. And this is a great picture of the gospel. God pursues us even when we whore after other things. I got to tell you, that word was really hard for me to deal with. I just kept reading this book, and I'm just like, my goodness, how many times does he say it in here? I didn't count them all, but at some form of the word, it's a lot. But Jen and I were talking at the table the other night, and it's like,
But what a good way to make us, in a sense, feel uncomfortable, because that's exactly what we do. That's exactly. We don't like the picture because we don't like to ever think, well, that's us. If you look at this book, you got 1 minute left. If you look at this book and see who you identify with in this book, if it's not Gomer, you're probably not thinking correctly. Because that's you. And that's why we're uncomfortable hearing the word. I know that's why I am. But that's us.